Greetings and welcome to the United States Transhumanist Party Virtual Enlightenment Salon. My name is Gennady Stolyarov II, and I am the chairman of the US Transhumanist Party. Here we hold conversations with some of the world's leading thinkers in longevity, science, technology, philosophy, and politics. Like the philosophers of the Age of Enlightenment, we aim to connect every field of human endeavor and arrive at new insights to achieve longer lives, greater rationality, and the progress of our civilization.
Okay, so you know how we like to dig in stuff that's maybe a little off the beaten path?
Yeah,
And you sent this one over to me, the US Transhumanist Party, and I gotta say, it's definitely different.
for sure.
I mean, it's not every day you encounter a political party talking about, like, radical life extension and
Yeah.
using science to basically solve all of humanity's problems.
Right, exactly.
And you're really interested in alternative political movements and you know how tech is going to, like, really impact society going forward.
Their time.
So we got this presentation by their chairman, this guy, Gennady Stolyarov II. It's a good starting point for our deep dive today. So let's just jump right in and see what we can unpack. What do you think?
Sounds good to me. Let's get into it.
All right, so first off, the U.S. Transhumanist Party, they haven't been around that long, actually. Founded in 2014.
Oh, wow. That
It's
recent.
pretty new on the scene. But here's the thing. They've run a presidential candidate in every single election since then.
That's interesting. I didn't realize they were that consistent.
Yeah, and Stolyarov mentioned their 10th anniversary was just last October, October 7th, 2024.
Okay.
He even ran through their past candidates, Zoltan Istvan back in 2014, Charlie Cam, and Liz Parrish in 2020. And most recently, Tom Ross and Daniel Tweed for the 2024 election.
I mean, it sounds like they're really serious about getting their ideas out there.
Yeah, they're definitely in it for the long haul. Now, getting to the heart of it, what does this party actually stand for?
Oh, that's the big question, isn't it?
Totally. So Stolyarov laid out three main principles. The first one is all about using science and tech to achieve, like, really significant life extension for humans.
Okay. I can see where that ties into the transhumanism idea.
Exactly. It's about pushing the boundaries of how long and how well we can live.
Makes sense.
Second, they want to create a culture, society, and political system that are super grounded in reason, science, and secular values.
So basically a society built on evidence and critical thinking.
Yeah, that's the gist of it. And then their third principle is pretty ambitious. They want to use science, technology, and rational discourse to tackle and ultimately eliminate those big existential risks that we're facing as a species.
Wow. Okay. That's a pretty tall order.
It is. It's like super ambitious. But what ties all these things together is this really strong emphasis on human flourishing and well-being.
So it's not just about tech for tech's sake. They see it as a tool to really improve the human experience.
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
They believe that advancements in science and technology are the key to, like, unlocking a better future for everyone.
I can see that.
Now, one thing that really stood out to me was Stolyarov's point about moving beyond the traditional left-right political spectrum.
Oh, yeah. That's always a tricky subject.
He basically argues that this whole left versus right thing is kind of a distraction, almost like a tactic used by the political elites to keep us focused on our differences instead of what we have in common. He thinks this traditional divide prevents us from achieving things that most people actually want, like better health, more prosperity, lasting peace, things that benefit everyone, regardless of their political leanings.
I mean, he's got a point. There's a lot of common ground that gets lost in the partisan fighting.
Exactly. And this leads directly into what he calls the great fallacy, the idea of zero-sum thinking.
Ah, so the idea that if one group wins, another one automatically loses.
Right. He says that's a flawed way of looking at things. Instead, the transhumanists believe in growing the pie through scientific and technological breakthroughs.
Okay, so creating more abundance so everyone can benefit.
Exactly. He even brought up historical examples like the Renaissance and the Enlightenment as times when human progress really expanded possibilities for everyone.
Right. Those were periods of incredible innovation and advancement across so many fields.
And you know how you're always seeking out new knowledge, different perspectives? That's kind of what I found so interesting about this whole philosophy.
Yeah, tell me more about that.
It's like they're offering this entirely different framework for tackling societal problems. Instead of seeing them as a fixed set of resources to be fought over, they believe we can actually create more resources through innovation.
I like that idea. It's a much more optimistic outlook.
It is. It's about expanding our possibilities, not just dividing up what we already have.
I can see how that would appeal to people who are looking for a different way of doing politics.
Exactly. Now let's get into some specifics. How does this philosophy translate into concrete policy proposals?
That's what I'm curious about.
Well, Stolyarov really emphasized removing obstacles to scientific and technological advancement.
So basically getting rid of anything that's holding back progress.
Exactly. He used the FDA as a prime example. He talked about how the average review process for new drugs and medical devices takes like 10 to 15 years.
Wow, that's a long time.
Yeah, and it costs billions of dollars. He argued that this system is stifling innovation and basically benefits big pharma companies more than anyone else.
So they want to streamline that process, make it faster and cheaper?
Exactly. They believe it would unleash a wave of new treatments and technologies.
That makes sense.
But it's not just about removing barriers. They also talked about the need for a major cultural transformation.
Oh, interesting. What kind of transformation?
It's all about achieving radical life extension. Many transhumanists actually identify as immortalists.
Wow, so they're talking about like potentially living forever.
Yeah, it's a pretty profound goal. They recognize that technology alone won't be enough. We need a fundamental shift in how we view aging and the potential for extending healthy lifespans.
That's a huge cultural shift.
It is. It's about embracing the possibility of living much longer and healthier lives.
I mean, it's a fascinating idea, but it would definitely require a lot of changes in our society.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Now, on a more practical level, they're big supporters of a whole range of technologies.
Like what?
Artificial intelligence, nanotechnology, automation, vertical farming, 3D printing of infrastructure. It's a pretty diverse list.
Yeah, they seem to be all in on technological progress across the board.
Exactly. They believe that all these advancements are crucial for creating a better future.
Okay, so let's talk about some specific examples. How do they see something like AI being used to achieve their goals? Like radical life extension or dealing with existential threats?
That's a great question. I mean, think about it. AI-driven drug discovery could potentially identify new therapies much faster and even personalize medicine based on our individual genetics.
Right. That could be a game changer for treating diseases and extending lifespan.
Exactly. And when it comes to existential threats, AI could play a role in monitoring and predicting things like asteroid collisions or environmental disasters.
That would give us more time to prepare and potentially prevent those disasters from happening.
Right. It's about using technology to anticipate and mitigate risks.
I see that.
Now, switching gears a bit, let's talk about political and electoral reform.
Sure.
They're big proponents of ranked choice voting.
Okay, can you remind me how that works again?
Basically, it lets voters rank multiple candidates on their ballot instead of just choosing one. And they believe this could lead to more genuine political competition because it eliminates that whole having to vote for the lesser of two evils thing.
I see. So it could open up the political landscape for third parties and independent candidates.
Exactly. It gives voters more options and more power.
I like that.
They also want to make it much easier for candidates to get on the ballot.
Because right now it's pretty difficult, isn't it?
Yeah, Stolyarov called the current thresholds extremely onerous. You often need tens of thousands of signatures just to get your name on the ballot.
Right, and that favors the established parties.
Exactly. He argued that these requirements are basically artificial barriers put up by the Democrats and Republicans to protect their own power.
So by lowering those barriers, they could level the playing field and make it easier for smaller parties to compete.
Precisely.
Yep.
It's about creating a more open and inclusive political system.
Makes sense.
And along those same lines, they're pushing for greater inclusivity for minor parties in political debates and media coverage.
Yeah, that's important. I mean, if you want to challenge the status quo, you need a platform to get your message out there.
Right. It's about giving alternative voices a chance to be heard.
Absolutely.
Now, one thing that Stolyarov emphasized was that changing laws isn't the only way to create change.
What else is there?
He believes that shifting the culture and the terms of public discussion is just as important, if not more so.
So changing hearts and minds along with policies?
Exactly. He brought up this concept of the Overton window.
I've heard of that. What was his take on it?
Well, the Overton window refers to the range of ideas that are considered acceptable for public discussion.
Right.
And he said their goal is to actively shift that window. So, for example, making something like radical healthy life extension a mainstream societal objective.
Oh, I see. So it becomes something that people are willing to talk about and support openly.
Exactly. He even compared it to how the idea of fighting cancer went from being radical to a central focus of medical research and public health.
That's a really interesting comparison.
Right. It shows how cultural attitudes can change over time.
For sure.
Now let's move on to foreign policy.
Right.
Their general stance seems to be in favor of peace and non-interventionism whenever possible.
Okay, so avoiding military conflicts and entanglement.
Exactly. And the big idea is to redirect resources away from what they call the military-industrial complex.
Right, the whole system that profits from war and military spending.
Yep. And they want to shift those resources towards building up what they call a scientific-industrial complex.
So basically a system that's focused on peaceful and productive endeavors.
Precisely. They specifically mentioned safe nuclear power as an example.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, they talked about thorium fuel cycle reactors, which they claim are basically meltdown-proof.
Thorium reactors. Okay, I'm not super familiar with those. Can you give me a quick rundown?
Sure. So unlike traditional uranium reactors, thorium reactors use thorium as fuel.
Okay.
And the key thing is they operate at much lower pressures and produce waste that's radioactive for a shorter period of time.
So less risk of meltdowns and less long-term radioactive waste.
Exactly. It's considered a much safer and more sustainable form of nuclear power.
That sounds promising.
It does. They're also strong advocates for peaceful international cooperation, more global trade, and the free exchange of scientific and technological information.
So basically breaking down barriers between countries and fostering collaboration.
Right. They see international collaboration as essential for driving progress on a global scale.
Makes sense.
Now, when it comes to those hot-button issues like abortion and gun control, they seem to be taking a different approach.
How so?
Well, Stolyarov said they don't have strong unified party positions on those specific issues.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, they pretty much leave those decisions up to individual members.
Okay.
Their long-term view is that future technological advancements might offer solutions that we can't even imagine right now.
Like what kind of advancements?
Well, he mentioned things like artificial wombs, which could potentially change the whole debate around abortion.
Wow, that's pretty futuristic.
It is. And he also talked about more sophisticated personal protective technologies that could maybe reduce the need for gun control.
Okay, so they're thinking way ahead, trying to find solutions that could bridge those divides.
Exactly. It's a very forward-looking approach.
It is. It's about focusing on potential rather than getting bogged down in current conflicts.
Right. Now, another interesting thing is that they're a pro-immigration party.
That's not something you hear every day.
Definitely not. They see immigration as a source of talent and innovation.
Okay.
Stolyarov specifically mentioned the Transhumanist Bill of Rights version 3.0.
What that?
It's a document that outlines a framework of rights not just for current humans, but also for future sentient entities like advanced AI or even beings we haven't encountered yet.
Wow, that's thinking really big picture.
They emphasize respect for individual rights regardless of national origin, as long as people are peaceful and productive members of society.
So it's about valuing individual contributions and potential.
Exactly.
I like that.
Now, if you want to dive deeper into their ideas, Stolyarov pointed us to their website.
Okay, I have to check that out.
They have their full party platform there. It's a pretty comprehensive document with 117 sections.
117. Wow, they really thought this through.
They have. And they hold regular membership votes on proposed platform changes.
So it's a very democratic process.
It is, and membership is free and open to anyone regardless of age or nationality.
That's really inclusive.
Yeah, they even have a special allied member status for people outside the U.S.
Wow. So they're truly trying to build a global movement.
It seems that way. And get this, they even support lowering the voting age for children and teenagers who they deem capable.
Wow, really? That's a pretty radical idea.
It is. They believe that young people should have a voice in shaping their future.
I can see their point.
Finally, Stolyarov made it clear that they're playing the long game.
What do you mean?
Their focus goes way beyond the typical 4-year election cycle. They're already looking ahead to the 2028 elections and beyond.
So they're in it for the long haul.
Definitely. They're committed to building a movement and shaping the future.
That's impressive.
It is. So to sum it all up, the U.S. Transhumanist Party is advocating for a pretty radical transformation of society driven by science and technology.
They definitely have a bold vision.
They want to remove barriers to scientific progress, create a culture that embraces radical life extension, and reform the political system to make it more inclusive and responsive to the needs of the future.
It's a lot to take in.
It is. They're dealing with some really big questions, and they're not afraid to challenge the status quo.
I think that's what makes them so interesting. They're forcing us to think differently about the future.
Exactly. And that brings us to our final thought for you to ponder.
Okay, I'm listening.
Given the U.S. Transhumanist Party's focus on extending healthy lifespans and using technology to bridge political divides, what other seemingly intractable societal challenges might we be able to solve in completely new ways in the coming decades?
That's a great question. it really makes you think about the potential for change.
It does. Maybe some problems that seem impossible to solve today might have solutions we haven't even imagined yet.
Thanks for bringing this to my attention.
Yeah.
It's definitely given me a lot to think about.
You got it. Always happy to explore the unconventional.
Me too. Thanks for another great deep dive.
Anytime. Until next time.
See you.
All right, welcome to another deep dive where we take stuff that you guys are curious about and really try to get to the bottom of it.
Yeah, try to make you an expert in like an hour, whatever it is we're talking about.
Yeah, make you the most informed person at the dinner party.
That's right.
And today we are diving into something that you suggested, and that is the U.S. Transhumanist Party.
That's right.
We got a whole bunch of interviews with the chairman of the party, Gennady Stolyarov II. These were done by Dominic Prouve on his show Liquid NH, and also Winit Apiu from Futurologism. So we got a bunch of different interviews to pull from here.
Great sources.
Yeah, and really the mission here is to understand, like, okay, what are the core goals of this party? What is their platform? How do they see the world, you know, in terms of politics and technology and where we're headed as a species? So
yeah,
let's start to unpack some of these core ideas. And I think the first thing that really pops out is that their sort of central aim is to put science, health, and technology really at the forefront of American politics.
Yeah, and Stolyarov makes the point that this really shouldn't be a partisan issue.
Yeah.
You know, if you look at polling, generally speaking, people from both sides of the aisle, they agree that technology is good. They want to see advances in technology to make our lives better.
Right. I mean, who doesn't want better healthcare? Who doesn't want access to better technology?
Exactly.
And they have this term for their philosophy, which is upwing. I think that's really telling. You know, they're for anything that contributes to longer, healthier, higher quality lives for as many people as possible, more prosperity, more opportunity.
Yeah, and he says that's a very deliberate choice, this upwing thing.
Yeah.
You know, because he wants to get away from this whole left-right dichotomy.
Right.
He doesn't really see them as fitting in with the Democrats or the Republicans.
And yet there's some overlap, right? I mean, their focus on making sure that the benefits of this progress reaches everybody could resonate with a lot of Democrats who champion the marginalized, and they often advocate for more access to technology and healthcare. And on the other hand, you know, their belief in technological progress and innovation, that could resonate with a lot of Republicans who often talk about ingenuity and development. And
Yeah, for sure.
so it's an interesting space that they're trying to carve out.
Absolutely.
Of course, they do get criticisms from both sides on the right. You know, there's a lot of, and particularly online, and we see figures like Alex Jones talking about, you know, transhumanism as being this global elite conspiracy. And Stolyarov is very quick to debunk that notion.
Yeah, I think it's interesting how this happens with ideas, especially like new ideas that are proposing kind of a big change in society.
Right.
They often get met with this kind of suspicion and almost like conspiracy theories, you know, like there's some hidden agenda here. And I think that's just a way of like dismissing the idea without having to actually engage with it.
Yeah, it's just a way to wave it away. And then on the left, they get a lot of criticism, you know, from more of the environmentalist or like neo-Malthusian perspective who worry about the consequences of, you know, too much technology, you know, resource depletion and things like that.
Right.
And Stolyarov tends to push back on that and say that, you know, that those aren't necessarily valid concerns, or at least we can overcome those.
Yeah, it's this classic tension between sort of like wanting to embrace progress, but also being mindful of potential downsides.
Yeah.
And so I think it's important to keep that in mind that even though the Transhumanist Party is very optimistic, those concerns about like resource management and things like that are definitely things we need to think about as we move forward.
Yeah, and I think that's a conversation that, you know, reasonable people from all different political persuasions should be able to have.
Absolutely.
Okay, so in terms of like government support for research, they actually advocate for increased funding for the NIH, but, and this is a caveat, they have reservations about the current leadership in the way that grants are allocated. They'd like to see more funding go towards really ambitious projects.
What I thought was really interesting is that they are huge fans of ARPAH.
Yes.
The Advanced Research Projects Agency for Health.
Yeah.
You know, because they see that as potentially being able to be more nimble and less risk averse than the NIH.
Right.
And so they point to research like Dr. John's work on brain aging, and they say we need to be funding ambitious projects like that.
Yeah, so they're not against government funding. They just want to see it, you know, allocated in a different way.
Exactly.
Okay, so that gets to their broader views on the role of government in driving technological progress. And I think one of the things that stands out here is their proposal for a UBI, a universal basic income, but funded in a very unique way.
Yeah, so instead of raising taxes to pay for the UBI, which is kind of the more traditional approach,
Yeah.
they proposed this thing called the federal land dividend.
Yes.
Which is basically they would take federal lands that are currently underutilized and they would lease them out for various commercial purposes. And then all the revenue from those leases would be put into a dedicated fund, and that would be used to fund the UBI. And they point to the Alaska Permanent Fund as a model for this.
Yeah, I mean, this is a really interesting idea, and I think, it's a way to potentially provide a safety net without having to raise taxes, which is going to appeal to a lot of people.
Yeah, and again, it really underscores their commitment to trying to find creative policy solutions that align with their kind of upwing philosophy.
Yes, and that, expanding opportunity for everybody. And they also had some pretty strong opinions on the government response to the pandemic. They were advocating for a huge expansion of healthcare infrastructure, rapidly building hospitals, a permanent increase in hospital capacity, because they felt that the existing infrastructure was clearly insufficient.
Yeah, and I think this is where they really differentiate themselves. There's a lot of talk about how much should the government intervene in healthcare, and you have people on both sides. But the Transhumanist Party, they're very clear that they think that the government needs to step in and actually build stuff and fund things.
Yeah.
And they contrast their view with the libertarian view as well.
Right.
Where libertarians would say, just get out of the way.
Yeah, just let the market handle it.
And the market will handle it.
They're saying, no, there's an active role for government to play in this.
Yeah. Yeah, they believe in building things.
Yeah.
They believe in funding things.
And they're also very much against, hyper caution and bureaucracy and things that sort of stand in the way of innovation.
Right. Anything that slows down progress is bad in their view.
Yeah. Okay, so this leads to their views on the FDA, which are, pretty strong. They want to see streamlining of the FDA approval process. Some members even want to see a complete abolition of the FDA. Others have proposed things like best choice medicine, which is kind of like how they do things in Japan. Can you explain that a little bit?
Yeah, so with best choice medicine, essentially a drug or a therapy or a device could be marketed after it's passed safety trials.
Okay.
But then they would continue to collect data on the efficacy of the drug or therapy or device after it's already available to patients.
So it's kind of like a rolling approval process almost.
Right. And the thinking is that if you have people that have serious conditions or are facing life-threatening conditions, we shouldn't make them wait potentially years for the completion of these, rigorous clinical trials.
Yeah.
If there's a chance that this could benefit them.
If it's safe, let's get it out there, and then we'll continue to gather data and see, how effective it is.
Exactly. So it's a different way of thinking about risk and benefit.
Right.
Than we have here in the U.S. with the FDA and their kind of very lengthy and rigorous approval process.
And, going back to their upwing philosophy, it's all about, okay, what's going to help people live longer and healthier lives? And anything that stands in the way of that is not good.
We don't want it.
They are very pragmatic in their approach. They're not really bound by, strict ideology. Okay, so that brings us to something that they talk about quite a bit, which is longevity escape velocity.
Yeah.
Which sounds like something straight out of Star Trek.
It does sound very futuristic.
Yeah.
But basically, they're on board with Dr. Aubrey de Grey's prediction that we could achieve longevity escape velocity within the next 12 to 15 years with a 50% probability.
Okay, so for those of us who don't, follow the science of aging, can you just give like a real basic definition of what longevity escape velocity is?
Sure. So it's the point at which we're adding more healthy lifespan than time is passing.
Okay.
So for every year that you live, science is adding more than a year to your remaining healthy life expectancy.
Wow.
So you're kind of outrunning aging.
That is a mind-blowing concept. And they believe that Dr. de Grey's SENS framework is the key to achieving that.
Yes.
Can you break down SENS just a little bit?
So SENS stands for Strategies for Engineered Negligible Senescence.
Got it.
And basically, it's a research framework that identifies 7 major categories of age-related damage that accumulate in the body over time. And it's not about trying to prevent that damage from happening.
Right.
It's about developing therapies that can repair that damage.
So it's like periodic maintenance on your body at a very fundamental level.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And Stolyarov points out that these 7 types of damage have been understood for several decades.
Okay.
No fundamentally new types of aging damage have been discovered in that time. So that gives them some confidence that a comprehensive repair strategy is actually doable.
That's really interesting.
Yeah.
Now, of course, they acknowledge that this is a probabilistic prediction, right? It could take longer than 12 to 15 years.
Yeah, Dr. DeGray himself has acknowledged that it could take longer. It could even take up to a century.
Right.
But he still puts the probability very high that we will reach it this century.
Okay.
And the Transhumanist Party says, regardless of the exact timeline, we need to be pushing for these advancements now.
Yeah.
Especially for younger people who stand to benefit the most.
I mean, the sooner we can get there, the better, right? Because there's,
Yeah.
I mean, thousands of people are dying every day from age-related diseases.
That's right.
So yeah, the sooner the better. And they're careful to distinguish between their focus on biomedical rejuvenation technologies and just, living a healthy lifestyle.
Yeah.
Diet and exercise, they're not against that.
Of course not.
But that's not going to get us to dramatically extended lifespan.
No, those things are good, but they're not going to fundamentally repair that aging damage.
Right. They're not going to get us to escape velocity. They also talk about cryonics as kind of like a backup option for people who might not make it.
Yeah.
Of course, that's still a long shot, right?
It is. It is.
Yeah.
It's highly experimental, and, there's still a lot of work to be done on both the cryopreservation side and the revival side.
Right.
But they see it as a potential option.
Yeah, and I think Stolyarov makes a really compelling point that, every day that we delay these advancements, thousands of people are dying from these age-related diseases, and so it really is almost like a humanitarian mission to try to speed this up as much as possible.
Yeah, they frame it as an ethical imperative to extend lifespan, because there's so much suffering that comes with aging.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, so let's talk about religion, because this is one of the things that comes up a lot. People are concerned about transhumanism, messing with God's plan or being somehow unnatural. How do they address those concerns?
Well, Stolyarov is very clear that transhumanism is not inherently anti-religious. In fact, he points to the existence of things like the Christian Transhumanist Association,
right?
The Mormon Transhumanist Association. There's Jewish transhumanists, Buddhist transhumanists, Muslim transhumanists.
There's a whole spectrum.
So he's saying, look, transhumanism is compatible with faith.
Yeah.
And he even points to some Catholic thinkers who argue that if we extend lifespan, then people would have more time to do good works.
Yeah, that's interesting.
So he's not seeing a fundamental conflict there.
Right.
And he thinks that a lot of the resistance is really just status quo bias, this human tendency to resist change.
Right.
It's like the same thing happened with the printing press, trains, anesthesia. All of these things were initially met with resistance from religious groups.
Yeah.
And then eventually people came around.
People adapted.
They adapted.
Yeah.
And so he's saying, we're not trying to deconvert people. We're just asking you to be open to the idea that, your theological framework is actually more flexible than you think.
Right. I think that's a good approach. It's not an attack on anyone's religion. It's just saying, hey, let's think about this in a different way.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so another term that comes up sometimes is technocracy, the idea of rule by experts. And
right.
What's the Transhumanist Party's stance on that?
So they believe that there is a place for qualified experts in making technical decisions.
Right.
If you're talking about something technical,
you want the experts to weigh in.
You want people that actually know what they're talking about to weigh in.
Yeah.
But they're very clear that this should never infringe on individual rights.
Right.
And they point to the pandemic lockdowns as an example, where even though the intention was to protect public health,
yeah,
they were very critical of the lockdowns because they felt that they were too broad and they infringed on people's liberties.
Yeah, it's a good point. Even if the experts have good intentions, there needs to be limits on their authority.
Right. And they also value things like diversity of choice.
Right.
They point to the Amish as an example. People should be free to choose how much technology they want in their lives.
Yeah, for sure.
So it's not about just having experts dictate everything. It's more nuanced than that.
Right.
It's like a multi-layered system where you have experts informing policy, but you also have a representative government.
Yeah.
And then you have this kind of inviolate sphere of individual choice.
Right. And in order to make sure that that representative government actually represents the people, they're big proponents of electoral reform.
Yes.
Things like ranked choice voting, proportional representation, making it easier for third parties to get on the ballot.
Absolutely.
So speaking of electoral efforts, they have been fielding presidential candidates since 2016.
Yeah?
What has been the main focus of those campaigns?
Well, Stolyarov says, each campaign is kind of built on the last one.
Okay.
So the first one with Zoltan Isvan in 2016 was really just about awareness raising.
Yeah.
Making people aware of transhumanism as an idea, as a movement. And in fact, Zoltan tried to present a transhumanist Bill of Rights at the U.S. Capitol.
Oh, wow. I didn't know about that.
Yeah, so, maybe a little unorthodox, but
it got people talking.
it got people talking for sure.
Mm-hmm.
And then the next couple campaigns with Charlie Cam and Tom Ross, they were more focused on building membership and really creating more content, more in-depth content. And they have this weekly Virtual Enlightenment Salon that they do.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
That's really interesting.
It's very cool.
Okay, so it hasn't necessarily been about winning elections in the traditional sense.
Right.
It's more about educating people, getting the word out, changing minds.
Exactly. Countering misinformation, especially because there's a lot of misinformation about transhumanism online.
For sure.
In these kind of like fringe communities.
Yeah, people have weird ideas about what it is.
Yeah, so they're trying to, push transhumanism further into the mainstream.
Yeah, and they've had some success with that. They've seen growth in their membership, and they're getting more media coverage.
Yeah.
But of course, ballot access is a huge challenge.
It is.
In the U.S., the two-party system is so entrenched, it's really tough to break through that.
Stolyarov described the ballot access laws as barriers that are basically erected by the two major parties to keep everybody else out.
Yeah.
And so they've focused on states that have lower signature requirements like Louisiana and Tennessee.
Right.
But even in those states, they've run into difficulties like COVID hit, and they couldn't.
Yeah, it's hard to get signatures.
It's hard to get signatures.
Yeah. Okay, so it sounds like they're very much still a grassroots movement that's primarily organized online.
Yeah, and I think that's the next frontier for them.
Right.
Is really trying to build that on-the-ground presence.
Yeah, get people out in the streets knocking on doors.
Exactly.
So let's address some of the common misconceptions about the party. One that we hear a lot is that it's elitist.
Right.
That it's just for rich people.
Right.
And Stolyarov pushes back very hard against that.
He does. He says the vast majority of their members are middle class.
Right.
It's a volunteer organization. It's funded by, everyday people that have regular jobs. And
yeah, they highlight how inclusive they are. Membership is free. They have all these free events online. And they have this transhuman club, which is like an online forum that's open to anyone.
Right. It's not a political organization. It's just for discussion.
Right, just to talk about the ideas.
Yeah.
So it does not sound like an exclusive club at all.
Not at all.
Another misconception is that transhumanists want to replace humanity with something else entirely. And that's not their aim at all.
No.
Right? It's about enhancing human capabilities.
That's right.
Overcoming limitations.
Right.
It's not about, getting rid of humans altogether.
No, they want to see humans continue to exist.
Right.
Potentially augmented by technology.
Yeah.
But free from death, disease, frailty, disability, all the things that cause suffering.
Yeah. Reach our full potential.
Exactly.
And they are even open to coexisting with other forms of sentience.
Yeah.
Whether that's advanced AI or enhanced animals or, even aliens if they show up.
Right.
They're like, okay, let's figure out how to live with each other.
Yeah, they have a very expansive view of sentience.
Yeah, so let's talk about their views on AI because that's obviously a huge topic these days.
It is.
And especially with the rapid progress that we've seen.
Yeah, they acknowledge how impressive these large language models are.
Yeah.
Like GPT and all the other ones that are coming out.
Yeah, it's amazing.
They can write, they can make art, they can make music, they can do all these things.
Yeah.
And the Transhumanist Party themselves, they've used generative AI to create some of their own art and music.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
That's really interesting.
So they're not against AI at all.
Yeah.
But they do agree with thinkers like Peter Voss, who say that these large language models probably aren't going to lead to AGI.
Okay.
Artificial General Intelligence.
Right.
They're very sophisticated, but they're still narrow AI.
Yeah, it's not the same as a truly conscious machine.
Exactly.
Okay.
Stolyarov still thinks that Ray Kurzweil's prediction of the singularity around 2045 is a reasonable estimate.
Okay.
So he's still thinking, 2040s we might see AGI.
Okay.
And he envisions a future where AI could be embodied, in physical forms like androids.
Yeah.
And where space travel is going to be a big thing and we'll have humans on other planets.
It's like a science fiction novel.
It is, but they believe it's going to happen.
Okay.
And they also say that it won't be a uniform future.
Yeah.
You'll have different societies and subcultures that adopt technology at different rates.
Right.
And so you'll have this kind of like hyperpluralism.
Yeah.
There's all sorts of different lifestyles and, people can choose how much technology they want in their lives.
Yeah. That's a very interesting vision of the future. Okay, so going back to radical life extension.
Yeah.
What are the most promising paths that they see?
Well, their main focus is still on biomedical rejuvenation.
Right.
Like Stolyarov's book, Death is Wrong.
Yeah.
He really lays out this case for why we need to be focused on this. And they're saying we need a lot more lab research,
Yeah.
Across various organisms to really study these interventions that can extend lifespan and health span.
Yeah, they're big fans of the Longevity Escape Velocity Foundation.
Yeah.
And the work they're doing, especially their mouse rejuvenation studies.
Yes.
Because they're like, okay, we need this data to really figure out what works.
We need solid scientific data.
Yeah. And they're also talking about the importance of AI
Yes.
in analyzing all this data.
That's right.
Because there's just so much of it now.
Yeah. And as we get more and more data, it's going to be very difficult for humans to analyze it all.
Right.
We need AI to help us.
Yeah, we need AI to crunch the numbers.
That's right.
And they're also saying we need a lot more researchers.
Yes, especially biologists.
Yeah.
People that are focused on empirical research.
Yeah, we need more people working on this problem.
That's right.
Yeah.
And in the nearer term, they see personalized medicine and health tracking as being, big areas of growth.
Right.
Where people can really take ownership of their own health.
Yeah. Get all that data about their own bodies and use it to make better decisions.
Yeah, and the whole idea is don't die.
Don't die.
Brian Johnson's motto, stay alive long enough to benefit from these advancements.
Right, that's the goal. Okay, so I want to get into Stolyarov's kind of philosophical views because I think that's a big part of what drives him.
Yeah.
He's involved in this party. He's the chairman. What would you say is the core of his philosophy?
I think a really big piece of it is this idea of the war on the forces of ruin.
Okay.
Which encompasses things like death, disease, decay, natural disasters, even cosmic threats.
So it's like this grand struggle against everything that can harm or destroy human life.
Yeah, exactly. He sees this as the defining characteristic of human existence. Mm-hmm. We're constantly battling against these forces. And he has this kind of individualist ethical framework.
Okay.
Where he believes that it's moral to act in your own enlightened long-term self-interest.
Interesting.
And so he sees striving for longevity and higher quality of life as not just like a personal preference, but as a moral imperative.
Wow.
You should want to live longer. You should want to be healthier because that's the good thing to do. And he thinks that this war on ruin should be the thing that unites humanity.
Yeah.
That we should be setting aside our differences and focusing on these shared existential threats.
Because ultimately, it doesn't matter what your political views are if we're all dead. Right?
Exactly.
Okay, so even if we do achieve radical life extension, he thinks there's still a lot of work to do.
Yeah, he thinks there will still be challenges, cosmic threats, and just figuring out, what is the purpose of human existence on these vast timescales?
Yeah, it's interesting to think about, what would we do with all that time?
Yeah.
Okay, what about the future after humanity, or like the idea of mind uploading?
So their main focus is on rejuvenation and gradual enhancement of the body.
Right.
They want to keep humans fundamentally human.
Okay.
Just, with better capabilities and longer lifespans.
Right.
Stolyarov is actually skeptical of what he calls destructive mind uploading.
Okay.
Where you basically transfer your consciousness to a computer because he thinks that creates a copy.
Right.
And the original you dies.
Yeah, it's not really you. It's like a clone of you.
Exactly. And he's concerned about losing that original I-ness.
Right, the continuity of your consciousness.
Yeah, that subjective experience that makes you you.
Right.
But he is open to the idea of gradual brain replacement.
Okay.
With artificial components, as long as you can maintain that continuity of I-ness.
So it's okay if your brain is slowly replaced with, non-biological material, as long as it's still you in there?
Yeah, as long as you don't lose that sense of self.
Right.
And this is one of the ways that they differentiate themselves from post-humanists.
Okay.
Transhumanists want to enhance humans.
Yeah.
They don't want to move beyond humans entirely.
Right.
And they still value humanism.
Yeah.
Things like individual rights, autonomy, rationality.
Okay.
And they do think that in the future, there will be all sorts of different types of sentient beings.
Right.
Maybe AI, maybe uplifted animals, maybe aliens.
It's going to be a wild world.
It's going to be a very diverse world.
Yeah.
And so we need to start thinking about, a framework of rights that can encompass all these different types of beings.
Right, because our current framework is really just designed for biological humans.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And they also think that even within human society, you'll have people that are, at different levels of technological integration.
Right.
You have people that are completely tech rejecting.
Yeah.
And then you'll have people that are, fully enhanced.
Yeah.
And they think that those people should all be able to coexist peacefully.
Yeah. That's really interesting. So, For someone listening to this who's intrigued but maybe not totally convinced, what are some of the key reasons why they should consider looking into the Transhumanist Party?
Well, Stolyarov makes the case that they offer an alternative to the hyperpolarization and the kind of meaninglessness of a lot of contemporary American politics.
Yeah, the two parties seem to just be fighting all the time and not really getting anything done.
Exactly. And he thinks that the Transhumanist Party can offer a more positive and constructive vision of the future.
Yeah.
Based on progress.
Right.
Technological progress, moral progress.
And a belief that things can get better.
That's right. They want to reignite that sense of hope and optimism.
Yeah. We need that right now.
We do.
And this idea of the war on ruin is a very powerful one.
It is.
It connects our everyday concerns about our health and well-being to these much bigger questions about the future of humanity.
Yeah, it's like a grand narrative that can give meaning to our lives.
Right.
And Stolyarov believes that transhumanism has the potential to be the next great paradigm for civilization.
Wow. Okay, so what is their ultimate vision for society?
Well, they want to see radical longevity achieved through reversing biological aging. They also envision an era of radical material abundance, where things like housing, healthcare, education, these become near free.
Yeah.
Or very easily accessible because of advanced technology, 3D printing, robotics, AI, all these things.
Yeah.
And all of this is predicated on continued accelerating progress.
Right.
Technology is going to keep advancing at an exponential rate.
Yeah.
But even in this future of abundance and longevity, they still say the human life is precious.
Right.
And that the war on ruin is still ongoing.
So it's not like we reach some utopian endpoint and then we can just relax.
No, it's an ongoing process of improvement.
Yeah.
It's about continuous transformation.
Right.
And this idea of boundless expansion, that's really at the heart of transhumanism.
Yeah. Okay. So to wrap up this deep dive, we've gone through a lot. We talked about their focus on science and technology, the upwing philosophy, some of their specific policy proposals, their vision for radical life extension, and how they address all these criticisms and misconceptions.
Yeah, we've really tried to give you a solid understanding of the U.S. Transhumanist Party.
Yeah, and if you want to learn more, which we highly encourage you to do, you can visit the Transhumanist Party website, Stolyarov's website, and he has a really great YouTube channel.
Yeah, tons of content.
Yeah, just search for G. Stolyarov II.
Yeah, and to leave you with something to think about, given all this talk about radical enhancement and longevity, what do you think are the most important values and principles for humanity to uphold as we move into this uncharted territory?
It's a big question.
It is.
It's the one that we all need to be thinking about.
Absolutely.
All right, well, thanks for joining us on this deep dive, and we'll see you in the next one.
Take care. Welcome to the deep dive. We've got a really fascinating question to dive into today. Could the U.S. Transhumanist Party, the ones advocating for radical life extension and all that, find common ground with something like the 2021 Medicare for All proposal?
It's an interesting question for sure.
We've got their platform and their constitution and even the Transhumanist Bill of Rights here.
Okay.
And, of course, all the details on Medicare for All.
You're right.
So let's see if we can untangle this knot of futuristic ideals and, real-world politics.
It's a fascinating juxtaposition, isn't it?
Yeah.
You have this group that's pushing for AI-driven healthcare and genetic modifications, and then you have this policy that wants to provide basic healthcare through a government-run system.
Yeah, it seems like they're coming from totally different universes.
Right.
But are there any points where they converge?
Well, one thing that jumps out is that both the USTP and Medicare for All really value universal access to healthcare. The USTP actually says in their platform that they see expanded access as a fundamental right.
Interesting.
And obviously that's the whole point of Medicare for All.
Right, so they agree on the what, but what about the how?
Exactly.
That's where things get a little sticky.
Absolutely. The USTP's approach is all about fostering a free market.
Okay.
Where technology advancements will drive down costs and increase accessibility. They talk about things like removing barriers to becoming a medical professional, encouraging competition, and reforming the patent system so you don't have monopolies on life-saving treatments.
It's almost like their philosophy is let's just unleash innovation and the market will take care of it.
Yeah.
But Medicare for All is a very different approach.
Right.
Government-controlled price negotiations. A single-payer system. That doesn't sound very transhumanist.
That's where things get really interesting because
Yeah.
the USTP really emphasizes individual liberty and minimal government interference.
Right.
So they could actually view a government-run healthcare system as like a threat.
A threat.
Yeah, to their core values.
Okay, so let's dig into that a little bit.
Sure.
What about Medicare for All specifically might concern the USTP?
Well, one concern could be just bureaucratic inefficiency. The USTP really criticizes what they see as like excessive government bureaucracy
Okay.
that's holding back progress. And they might worry that a big centralized system like Medicare for All would be slow to adapt to new technologies.
Right, and they're all about rapid innovation. Okay, so let's imagine for a second.
Okay.
There's a new gene therapy that can cure a disease that was previously incurable.
Right.
But it's incredibly expensive.
Yeah.
Would Medicare for All embrace and cover that?
It's a good question.
Or would it get bogged down in bureaucracy and, cost-benefit analyses?
I think that would keep a transhumanist up at night.
Definitely. And then there's this whole issue of individual choice. The Transhumanist Bill of Rights, which the USTP is a big supporter of, emphasizes something called morphological freedom. The right to modify your own body with technology.
Right.
So we're talking genetic enhancements, advanced prosthetics, even brain-computer interfaces.
Yeah, all of that.
Would a government-run system allow people to choose those treatments even if they're not medically necessary in the traditional sense?
I mean, that's a big question.
Yeah.
It gets to the heart of the philosophical difference between these two approaches.
Okay.
Medicare for All, as its design, is really focused on just providing like a basic level of healthcare to everybody.
I see.
It might not be designed to accommodate all these like radical elective treatments.
Especially if they're costly.
Yeah, especially if they're costly or experimental.
But the USTP might argue that if you limit access to these cutting-edge technologies, you're limiting human potential.
Yeah.
They see these technologies as not just about treating illness, but about pushing the boundaries of what it means to be human.
You got it.
And that's where the Transhumanist Bill of Rights comes into play. It's about protecting individual autonomy and freedom of choice when technology is so closely connected to our bodies and minds.
Exactly.
So the question is, could a government-run healthcare system, even one with good intentions like universal coverage, ever really align with this vision of individual empowerment and technological freedom?
Good question.
It is a good question. We'll have to think about that one.
Yeah.
But before we jump to any conclusions,
Okay.
let's look at an example that might shed some light on this potential clash of ideologies.
I'm listening.
Okay, so you included Michael Moore's documentary Sicko in the source material,
Right.
which really criticizes the American healthcare system,
Yeah.
highlighting the inefficiencies, the inequalities, and the profit-driven motives.
It's a powerful film.
Yes.
Oh.
How do you think the USTP would react to that film?
That's a good question. I think on the one hand, they would probably agree with the film's portrayal of the problems. They've been pretty vocal critics of the influence of special interests and the need for more efficient, patient-centered solutions.
But would they see Medicare for All as the answer?
That's where it gets a little tricky. Remember, the USTP is all about market-driven solutions,
Right.
technological innovation, and individual choice.
Right.
They might see a government-run system as basically just trading one set of problems for another.
So it's like they're saying, yes, the system is broken,
Yeah.
but instead of patching it up with government regulations, let's build something total new.
That's a great way to put it.
They believe that if we remove barriers to innovation, encourage competition,
Right.
and let individuals make their own healthcare decisions, we can create a system that's more efficient and aligns with their values.
I think so.
So it's not just about expanding access to existing treatments. It's about creating a system that can keep up with the rapid advancements in biotech, AI, and all these other fields that they think will revolutionize healthcare.
Absolutely. It really makes you think, would the USTP, with their focus on individual liberty and a future of, radical technological advancement, could they actually vote for Medicare for All?
That's the big question. Let's put ourselves in the shoes of a USTP member for a minute.
Okay.
What are the factors they'd be thinking about when considering this issue?
Well, on the one hand, the idea of universal coverage would be pretty appealing.
Right.
Their platform states pretty clearly that they see healthcare as a right, not a privilege.
Yeah.
And in theory, Medicare for All would achieve that.
Right, but then there's this tension with their belief in individual liberty
Right.
and limited government.
Exactly. Imagine a scenario where, a new life extension therapy becomes available.
Good.
Something that could add like decades to someone's life.
Wow.
It would probably be super expensive, maybe even controversial.
Uh-huh.
Would a Medicare for All system that's really focused on basic care for everyone be willing to cover that?
Especially if it's considered elective.
Right. Or experimental?
Yeah. The USTP might see that as like a direct infringement on their vision of a future where individuals can choose how they want to use technology to modify their bodies and enhance their lives.
Absolutely. And this conflict goes beyond just future technologies.
Right.
The USTP platform also calls for changes to the patent system to stop monopolies that drive up costs.
That's interesting. Because in a way that aligns with Medicare for All's goal of negotiating drug prices to make them more affordable.
Exactly. They're both trying to address high costs, but from different angles.
So there's a point of convergence.
Yeah.
They both want a more equitable and accessible healthcare system.
Right, but the key difference is how they want to get there.
Okay.
Medicare for All relies on government regulation and the central approach.
While the USTP prefers market solutions.
Yes, competition and individual choice.
It's like they're looking at the same problem through different lenses.
It is. Medicare for All wants to like rein in the free market.
Yeah.
Use government control to make things fair and affordable. The USTP thinks the solution is empowering the free market, removing barriers to innovation.
Okay.
And letting competition drive down costs.
So at its core, it's an ideological difference.
Yeah.
It makes me wonder if the whole debate about Medicare for All is even the right way to think about it from a transhumanist perspective.
Interesting. Tell me more.
Well, instead of asking, should we have Medicare for All?
Yeah.
Maybe the USTP would be asking, how can we create a system that's both universally accessible and technologically advanced enough to keep up with innovation and the possibilities of human enhancement?
Now you're thinking like a transhumanist.
They wouldn't just be happy with fixing a broken system.
No.
They would want to create a system for a future where technology is a part of human health and longevity.
Exactly. But, you know, some people would say that the USTP's vision is too idealistic, too focused on individual choice and these radical technologies, and that it ignores the need for basic, affordable care for everyone.
How would the USTP respond to that?
I think they would argue that their approach isn't about ignoring basic care. It's about transforming the whole system to make it more efficient, innovative, and responsive to a rapidly changing society.
So they would say that a system that supports technological advancement will eventually lead to better, more affordable treatments for everyone.
Exactly, not just for a select few.
It's like they're saying, don't just give people fish. Teach them how to build better fishing rods.
Right.
And maybe even create fish farms that can feed everyone.
That's a great analogy.
Okay, so back to our question.
Yeah.
If there was a vote on Medicare for All within the USTP, how do you think it would go?
It's hard to say, but I bet it would be a heated debate.
Yeah.
There would be some who see the benefits of universal coverage.
Right.
And might be willing to compromise on some of their ideals.
To achieve that.
But there would also be those who see it as like going against their core principles. And would probably fight against it.
So it's this classic dilemma, balancing a desire for a better present with a vision for a radically different future.
Exactly.
And the USTP, with their unique perspective on technology and individual liberty, is facing this dilemma in a way that most political groups aren't.
And that's why this discussion is so fascinating. We're not just analyzing policies. We're trying to understand the deeper ideas that are shaping how we think about healthcare.
Technology and the future.
Exactly.
So what's the takeaway for our listener who's been with us this whole time?
I think the takeaway is that there are no easy answers.
Yeah.
This is a complex issue.
Definitely.
But if we understand the core values of both the USTP and the Medicare for All movement, we can start to see where they agree and disagree.
And maybe we can start to imagine a future where healthcare isn't just about treating illness.
Yeah.
But about expanding human possibilities in ways we can't even fully grasp yet.
It feels like we're really on the edge of like a massive change in healthcare.
Yeah.
And the conversation we're having right now about these transhumanist ideas and how something like Medicare for All could affect things, it's right at the center of that change.
It really is. We're talking about stuff that would sounded like science fiction a few decades ago.
Right.
Gene editing, artificial intelligence, brain-computer interfaces.
It's crazy to think about.
It's not just theory anymore.
No.
This stuff is becoming real.
And it could totally change how we think about health and how long we live and even what it means to be human.
And that's what makes the USTP so interesting.
I agree.
They're not just pushing for policies. They're talking about a whole new way to think about healthcare. One that embraces all this new technology and sees it as a way to, like, enhance and empower people.
They're asking, what if we could use technology to not only cure diseases, but to live longer, be smarter, even merge with machines?
It's mind-blowing.
I know.
Those are big questions, and we need to start taking them seriously.
I think so. They're looking ahead, trying to figure out what challenges and opportunities these advancements will bring.
And by doing that, they're making us think about our own values,
right?
Our ethics,
our
vision for the future.
And that's where the tension with Medicare for All is really interesting.
Right.
Because while Medicare for All is a good idea, it's meant to deal with the problems we have now.
Right, like making healthcare affordable and accessible.
Exactly. But the USTP is looking beyond that.
So they're thinking about a future where healthcare isn't just about fixing what's wrong.
Right.
It's about making what's right even better.
Exactly. About reaching our full potential.
And that's where the conflict comes in.
Yeah.
Because if you're focused on just basic care for everyone, you might not want to spend money on expensive experimental treatments.
It's true, even if those treatments could do amazing things.
Right, like enhance our abilities or help us live longer.
Yeah. The USTP might say that if you restrict those technologies, you're restricting what humans can become.
Holding back progress.
Exactly. And it all goes back to the Transhumanist Bill of Rights.
Which they're really passionate about.
They are. It's about making sure people have the freedom to choose what to do with their own bodies and minds.
Even if it involves using technology in ways that not everyone agrees with.
Exactly. So we're not just talking about healthcare.
Right.
We're talking about autonomy.
Self-determination. In a world where technology is becoming a part of us.
That's it. That's why this whole conversation is so important.
As we enter this new era of high-tech healthcare, we have to talk about our values.
Our ethics.
And what kind of future we want.
Absolutely.
So what's the one thing you want our listener to think about after this deep dive?
I think the most important thing is to be open-minded.
Okay.
To question what you think you know.
Yeah.
To be excited about new ideas, to have these conversations with a sense of curiosity.
Because the future of healthcare is being shaped right now.
Yes, by all of us.
It's up to us to decide what it looks like.
I agree. And that's what makes it so exciting.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, that's a great place to end our deep dive today. We hope this has given you some food for thought and maybe even sparked some new ideas about the future of healthcare.
Me too. You ever get that feeling?
What feeling's that?
Like everything's just speeding up.
Oh, yeah.
Technology, the world, like everything.
Yeah, for sure. Keeping up is a job in itself, right?
Totally. And that's kind of why we're here, right?
Exactly. So. Cut through all that noise and find the really interesting stuff.
Yep. Today, we're looking at something pretty interesting.
Intriguing, even. We're going deep on the U.S. Pirate Party and the U.S. Transhumanist Party.
Sounds like an odd couple.
You'd think so, right?
Yeah.
But, you know, the material you sent over really suggests there's more common ground than you'd expect.
Yeah, let's do a quick intro to each group based on those YouTube videos you found.
That was good.
Okay, so Gennady Stolyarov II from the Transhumanist Party mentioned their start date, October 2014.
Okay.
Ambitious agenda, too.
Ambitious how?
Their main things are extending human lifespan, like, radically, through tech and science.
Right.
Building a society based on reason and science, and tackling those big existential threats.
Okay.
You know, the ones that could wipe us out.
Right. Their goal, to put science, health, and technology front and center in U.S. politics.
Interesting.
Because they feel it's missing from the mainstream conversation.
That's a key point, that gap they feel exists. They see technology as, like, this transformative force.
Right.
But it's not getting the attention it deserves in traditional politics.
And then you've got the U.S. Pirate Party.
Right, right.
Jolly Mitch, he summed up their core as a strong belief in personal privacy and government transparency.
Makes sense.
They actually started in Sweden back in 2006.
Wow, didn't realize that they'd been around that long.
And the U.S. Party was one of the first offshoots.
So you've got one group pushing tech boundaries.
Yep.
And the other one safeguarding individual liberties in this increasingly digital world.
Exactly. So today's mission, to dig deep into these two seemingly different movements.
Find out where their ideas connect.
Yeah, where are those surprising points of alignment? And what does it tell us about the future of political thinking as tech just keeps advancing?
Great questions. Okay, so where do we even begin to find those common threads?
Well, one jumped out immediately.
What's that?
a rock-solid commitment to individual privacy and liberty.
Interesting.
In one of the Transhumanist Party's online discussions, Stolyarov directly quoted their platform.
Okay.
It emphasized individual privacy and liberty over how to apply technology to one's personal life.
Powerful statement.
And it goes further, saying each individual should remain completely sovereign in the choice to disclose or not disclose personal activities, preferences, and beliefs.
So they're not just talking about data privacy. This is about a much deeper principle of individual self-determination.
It really is. And it seemed to hit home for Jolly Mitch from the Pirate Party, too.
Yeah, he said that the Pirate Party and the Transhumanist Party have a lot more in common than what may meet the eye.
Right.
And guess what he highlighted as a major connection point?
I'm guessing it's this personal privacy and autonomy thing.
You got it, especially when it comes to tech.
Makes sense when you think about it.
Totally. If you're advocating for people to control their own bodies through tech, you're probably going to be worried about their digital freedom and privacy, too.
For sure.
For our listeners, the key takeaway here is that both these groups, despite their different focuses, one on radical tech, the other on digital rights, have this bedrock belief in individual control over their life and information. That's big, especially in today's world.
Absolutely. It's all about empowering the individual in this increasingly tech-driven world. Another big overlap is their shared view on technology itself. Both groups are forward-looking.
Yeah, the transhumanists are all about radical life extension, AI, automation.
Right.
And they see the internet as this liberating force.
Right. They feel mainstream politics often misses just how powerful tech can be.
And it's cool that the Pirate Party, even though they're rooted in the digital world, they don't seem to have a narrow view of technology.
Right. They seem open to it on a broader level.
Jolly Mitch said that the pirate movement, because it was born in the 21st century, is naturally more open to technological change. They even talked about AI and made these really interesting comparisons to how new technologies in the past, like auto-tune in music or electric guitars, were met with pushback.
It's true. People often resist new tech.
Mike Lin and Jason Geringer, they brought up those historical debates.
Right. Really highlights how our reactions to new tech often follow a similar pattern.
What strikes me is that both parties see tech as a dynamic force shaping our future, not something to fear.
I agree. They both understand that technology can be a powerful tool for societal change. And that perspective naturally leads to another point of convergence, their willingness to challenge the status quo and embrace change.
Yeah, that came through when Gennady Stolyarov II responded to being called extreme.
I remember that.
He basically argued that throughout history, dramatic change has been the norm.
Makes you think, doesn't it?
Totally. He said clinging to the status quo bias, this idea that things will stay pretty much as they are, that's actually a really risky move.
Big risk.
He even used some examples. Mesoamerican civilizations meeting the Spanish, Japan's sudden encounter with Commodore Perry.
Yeah, to illustrate how ignoring potential radical shifts can have huge consequences.
Exactly. For our listeners, the point here is that both groups get that the future isn't just going to be a slightly tweaked version of today.
They're thinking ahead.
And they're figuring out how to handle those potentially massive changes.
That's crucial. They recognize the need for proactive thinking about the future, even if some possibilities seem far-fetched right now.
Right. And that leads to the question of who benefits from these advancements. Both groups were concerned about ensuring the benefits of tech are shared widely.
Yeah, they don't want it to just be a privilege for a select few.
Gennady Stolyarov II had a really interesting take on this.
What was that?
He pointed out how tech that used to be luxury items like cars or mobile phones eventually became common, even reached people in developing countries.
It's true. Technology tends to become more accessible over time.
His example, a subsistence farmer in sub-Saharan Africa with a more powerful phone than a 1980s CEO.
Wow. Puts things in perspective.
Right. He also mentioned that early versions of technologies often have bugs and are riskier, suggesting wider adoption leads to increased safety and affordability.
That's a great point.
So for you listening, the takeaway is that while there might be initial gaps in access, history shows that progress often leads to wider availability over time.
That historical context is really valuable for understanding where new tech might go. Now, let's shift back to the digital world. Both parties were big on digital rights and freedoms.
Gennady Stolyarov and Drew Bingaman called it digital liberation.
A very pirate party kind of thing.
Right. And this is where the Pirate Party's core mission really connects with the Transhumanist Party's focus on individual liberty.
It's like two sides of the same coin.
They talked about the DMCA, the Digital Millennium Copyright Act.
Yeah.
And the Pirate Party's push for much shorter copyright terms.
Right.
Like 10 to 14 years after the author's death.
Huge difference from how it is now.
Alan Crowley gave this unsettling example of corporations copywriting other people's stuff and then suing them.
Oof. Yeah, that's a problem.
For our listeners, both parties see a need for a digital space that empowers people, not corporations or restrictive laws.
It's about balancing the rights of creators with the public's access to information and culture. And that ties into the concept of bodily autonomy, which the transhumanists call morphological freedom.
Oh, this was a cool connection. So someone from the transhumanist side brings up morphological freedom.
The idea that you have the right to modify your own body using technology.
Right, and Jolly Mitch immediately connects it back to the Pirate Party.
I love that he did that.
Yeah, he brings up those classic images of pirates with peg legs and hooks.
Makes you realize how long body modification has been around.
Totally, and he says it would be awful hypocritical for them to oppose someone's right to modify their body.
It's your body, your life, your choice.
Exactly. So there's a clear alignment on individual control over your own physical form. What's interesting here is that both parties are all about self-ownership. And that extends to both our physical and digital selves.
Absolutely. It's about individual sovereignty through and through. And they both expressed skepticism towards corporate power and the influence of money in politics.
Mitch was really outspoken on this. He straight up called corporate personhood bullshit.
Yeah, he didn't hold back.
And pointed to the Citizens United case as a major reason for corruption in U.S. politics because of all that corporate money flooding in.
It's a valid concern.
His point, corporations aren't people.
Right.
And getting corporate money out of politics is core to the Pirate Party. The idea of corporate personhood itself is a legal concept, not a constitutional right, which adds weight to their argument. What's important for you is that both parties are wary of concentrated power, be it government or big corporations. They both want to see more power in the hands of individuals.
That shared distrust of concentrated power and the desire for individual empowerment is a strong connection. And their alignment seems to go even further. They touched on Pan-Americanism and immigration, too.
Oh, right. The transhumanists support closer collaboration within the Americas.
Makes sense, given their global outlook.
And they're for easier legal immigration.
Yeah, they see the current system's issues as a driver for illegal immigration.
This seemed to resonate with the Pirate Party's Pan-American plank. While it's not about creating one big entity, they aim for more cooperation. And they acknowledge how recent hostilities between countries like the U.S. and Mexico seem a bit forced.
Interesting.
So both groups seem to envision a more interconnected, collaborative approach within the Americas.
A shared vision for tackling global issues. And then there's the concept of evidence-based policies, which is central to the Pirate Party.
Right. They stressed looking at what actually works to improve lives, not just sticking to ideologies.
Pragmatic approach.
Totally. They used drug decriminalization in Portugal as an example. It's had some positive results.
That's a good example.
This focus on what works, not just sticking to rigid positions, seems like another area of overlap.
I think so, too. It suggests they want to move past partisan divides and look for real solutions.
For sure. This focus on pragmatism and data, not just ideologies, fits with the Transhumanist Party's focus on reason and science.
A shared commitment to solutions that actually improve things, which is often missing in mainstream politics.
You got it. So, for our listeners, both parties prioritize practical, evidence-backed solutions over rigid stances.
Absolutely. All of this agreement makes you wonder, could they actually work together?
That's what they were talking about.
Really?
Both Mitch and Gennady Stolyarov II were enthusiastic about closer ties.
Like what?
They mentioned endorsing each other's candidates, working on things like digital rights, even learning from each other's organizational strategies.
Interesting.
They even brought up examples like the Broad Front in Uruguay and the Fusion Party in Australia.
Those are good examples of smaller parties joining forces to have a bigger impact.
And get this. A motion was put forward during a Pirate Party meeting to formally explore collaboration.
That's significant.
Totally. The takeaway for our listeners is that this isn't just talk. There's a real desire to turn this agreement into action.
It sounds like they recognize that despite their different main focuses, their values and goals have enough in common to build on.
For sure. Now, while we focused on the overlap, they did briefly touch on potential differences.
Right. Religion and spirituality came up.
And both parties admitted they're big tent groups.
Meaning their members hold a wide range of beliefs.
Right. But honestly, from their conversations, they agreed on way more than they disagreed.
It seems those shared principles are a strong foundation for working together.
Yeah, they do. So what could the future of this collaboration look like, and how can our listeners engage?
Good question. Those ongoing discussions and that motion for formal collaboration are key things to watch.
They also mentioned platforms where these talks continue.
Oh, right. The Pirate Party's Talk the Plank podcast.
And the Transhumanist Party's Virtual Enlightenment Salon.
Both on YouTube.
Worth checking out if you want to go deeper.
And let's not forget the technical skills in these communities.
For real. The California Pirate Party, for instance, has a GitHub repository where they're exploring blockchain voting solutions.
Cool. That's a concrete area where they could collaborate on projects that could impact democracy and transparency in a big way.
A collaborative geek swarm to tackle those tech challenges?
You love it.
They also talked about the importance of local activism building stronger ground games.
Essential for any political movement.
They seem to see potential in working together locally to grow their reach.
Smart move. So what we've learned from this deep dive is there's a surprisingly deep alignment between these two groups. Groups that might seem totally different at first glance.
Yeah, it's their shared commitment to individual liberty, their openness to technology, and their willingness to challenge the status quo that make them such a good fit. Groups that appear totally different can find so much in common when they focus on core principles and a shared vision.
It's about looking beyond the surface.
Exactly. So here's something for our listeners to think about. As technology keeps reshaping society, are we going to see more of these unusual political alliances? Ones built on shared values and a focus on human progress.
Fascinating question.
What other seemingly unlikely team-ups might we see as the political landscape adapts to this rapidly changing world?
It's exciting to think about.
If you're interested in exploring more, both parties have websites. They encourage you to join Spree, and you can be a member of other parties too.
That's great. Very inclusive.
We encourage everyone to check out their platforms, listen to their discussions, and maybe even get involved in shaping this really interesting intersection of technology and politics. It's a space to watch.
For sure.
Okay, so, we've been following the U.S. Transhumanist Party for a while now, and you sent over some pretty big updates from their website.
Huge updates, actually.
Yeah, so we're calling this a deep dive because that's what it is.
Yeah, deep dive for sure.
They're going to look at what they're doing internally, like what's changing.
Exactly.
So what do we got?
So we've got their platform, vote number 9.
Okay.
And then some decisions that they made about how they do investigations within the party.
Right.
And then also how they handle emergencies. So these are really procedural things, but kind of interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. And all this happened between February 17th and March 10th?
Of this year. Yeah.
Of this year. Wow. So really recent.
Very recent.
So big picture, like what is the big change here?
So the main thing is that they have adopted several new sections in their political platform.
Okay.
That's Article 6 of their Constitution, and then a whole new article, Article 9, which is about emergency actions.
Okay, so let's start with the platform updates.
Sure.
Like what new things have they added?
Okay, so one of the biggest ones is a new section, and this one's all about defeating COVID-19.
Okay, so that's interesting, given that they are future-oriented and science and technology focused. What does that look like in the context of COVID?
So they're basically advocating for a concerted scientific and technological effort to completely eliminate COVID-19.
Wow. Okay, so that's ambitious.
Very ambitious.
What does that mean? Like what kind of solutions?
Okay, so they talk about the development of a universal vaccine. So something that would just work for all variants and provide lasting immunity.
Okay.
They also want to see antibodies that can neutralize all variants and reliable cures for long COVID.
Wow, that's a tall order.
Yeah, so huge investment in scientific and technological solutions.
Right, so very science-driven.
Right.
But, obviously the pandemic has been politicized. There's been a lot of different responses. So what is their stance on those non-scientific measures that we've all seen?
So this is where their libertarian side really comes out.
Okay.
So this new section explicitly states that the USTP only supports scientific and technological solutions.
Okay.
No lockdowns.
Gotcha.
They don't want any restrictions on liberty or medical choice.
Okay.
And they use the term demonization of people's personal health choices around COVID-19.
Right.
They also don't want any mandated behavior that could potentially increase someone's risk of getting COVID.
Okay, so very pro-individual liberty while also being pro-science.
Yeah.
Gotcha. So what else is new in the platform?
Okay, so another key one is section CXX, which is all about artificial intelligence.
Okay.
And they really paint a pretty positive picture of AI.
Okay, so they're AI optimistic, I guess you could say.
Yeah, absolutely. To really emphasize its potential for things like creativity, problem solving, curing diseases, new opportunities, and they even mentioned like a radical abundance because of AI.
Wow, okay, so that's a very forward-looking view. But what about the potential risks of AI? You know, we hear all the time about AI safety.
Right. So they do mention the importance of AI safety and making sure that AI is aligned with human values.
Okay.
But they do support restrictions on the use of AI for like intentionally destructive purposes.
Okay.
And a big one for them is they want to ban autonomous weapons.
Right, so that's something that we hear a lot in the ethics discussion about
Yes.
AI. Anything else on AI?
Yeah, so they also have a part that talks about addressing bias in AI systems.
Oh, right, because algorithms can be biased.
Yeah, like racial or gender bias that can be unintentionally built in, so they want to address that.
That's really important.
It is.
Okay, anything else on AI?
Yeah, they also have a part where they kind of push back against what they call unsubstantiated speculation about AI.
Okay.
So they don't want alarmist hype or doomsday pronouncements.
Okay.
They also don't want any restrictions on individual liberty
Yeah.
in the name of stopping like dangerous AI.
So that's interesting because where do you draw the line between unsubstantiated speculation and legitimate concern?
Yeah, that's a hard question.
Especially since, you know, there is research that shows AI can perpetuate societal biases.
Yeah, definitely.
So it's a fine line, I guess, they're trying to walk.
Yeah.
Okay, so it sounds like a balanced approach, embracing AI's potential, but being cautious about, like you said, overblown fears and restrictive policies.
Right.
Okay, what else is new?
So they've got section CXXI, which introduces their stance on reversible cryopreservation.
Okay, cryopreservation. So that's the idea of preserving a body at very low temperatures with the hope of reviving it later.
Right.
That's a pretty core transhumanist concept. So
Yeah.
what's their specific policy on that?
So they view cryopreservation as a way to uphold an individual's right to life
Okay.
by offering them the option to essentially wait for future medical breakthroughs.
Right.
So they're proposing $10 billion
Wow.
in funding annually.
$10 billion.
Yeah, for
Yeah.
research into reversible cryopreservation.
That's a huge investment.
Yeah, they're serious about this.
Wow. Okay, so that would go to like research institutions and companies working on this.
Yeah, exactly. Reputable institutions with a proven track record.
So clearly they see this as a priority.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so moving on, I see a section called Public Money for Public Code.
Yeah, and it's all about open source software.
Open source. Okay, so break that down for us.
Okay, so their stance is that public funds that are used for software development should mainly benefit the public.
Okay.
So they want to prioritize making that code publicly available open source.
Okay, so everyone can use it and modify it.
Exactly.
And this is typically licensed under GPL v3 or something similar.
Yeah, GPL v3 is a common one.
Okay, so why do they think this is so important?
Well, their argument is that taxpayer money shouldn't be used to create software that just benefits a handful of companies.
Okay, so it's about the public good.
Right, okay. And they specifically mention LibreOffice as a good alternative to Microsoft Office.
Okay, so free and open source software that anyone can use.
Yeah.
Okay, so it's about access.
Yeah, and also encouraging collaboration and development.
Right, so more people can contribute.
Exactly.
Okay, I'm seeing a section here on privacy on social media.
Yeah, this one's about supporting better privacy settings on social media platforms.
Okay, so like what kinds of things are they talking about?
So they want users to have more control over their data.
Okay.
They want those privacy settings to be easier to use, and they want people to be more aware of them.
Okay, so it's about like transparency and giving users more options.
Yeah, and the goal is to prevent malicious actors from getting hold of people's data.
Right, because that's a huge problem these days.
Yeah.
Okay, so those are all really important points. Now there's a couple sections about security and the role of government.
Yeah.
So let's jump into those.
Okay, so the first one is about putting limits on what government agencies can do when
Yes,
it comes
sir.
to security. So specifically, they want to prevent the government from opposing or weakening security measures that companies are taking.
Okay, can you give us an example?
Yeah, so they mentioned the issue of government agencies asking for backdoors in software.
Right, so they can access data.
Yeah, and their point is that if the government can get in, so can hackers.
Yeah, that's a big debate in the cybersecurity world.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay, what about whistleblowers?
So section CXXV is about that.
Okay.
They want to create a security whistleblower program.
Okay, what would that do?
So it would allow people to report security vulnerabilities in companies or government institutions.
Okay.
And it would protect them from any negative consequences for speaking out.
So they wouldn't get fired or blacklisted or something.
Exactly.
So it's about encouraging people to come forward.
Yeah, and making sure security is taken seriously.
Gotcha. Okay, so we've covered all the new sections in the platform.
Right.
Now, what about the amendments to the existing sections?
Okay, so they've made a bunch of changes to keep things up to date.
All right, let's hear about them.
So one big one is about the Electoral College.
Okay.
So they've changed it to specifically advocate for electing the president based on the popular vote.
So getting rid of the Electoral College.
Yeah.
Okay.
And they want to use a system like ranked preference voting.
Okay, so that's where voters rank the candidates.
Exactly.
Okay, so that's a pretty big change. What about their stance on taxation?
So the section which is about taxes initially proposed a flat sales tax.
Okay.
But now they've added an exception for life necessities.
Okay, so what counts as a life necessity?
Things that people need for survival, like food and water.
Okay, so those things wouldn't be taxed.
Right.
Okay, so that makes sense. It takes into account basic needs.
Exactly.
What else has changed related to COVID?
So Section XCI, which was originally about a universal basic income specifically for COVID, has been revised.
Okay.
So now they want to cover all the costs of COVID treatment and vaccination for everyone in the U.S.
Wow, so for an indefinite period of time.
Yeah, indefinitely.
Wow. Okay, so that's a big shift.
Yeah.
And their reasoning is that making people pay creates a barrier.
Right.
Okay, what about the travel chaos that happened during the pandemic?
So they've updated Section CI to acknowledge the massive flight delays and cancellations they all experienced.
Yeah.
So now they're calling for measures to help airlines get back to their pre-COVID capacity.
Okay, so basically get things back to normal.
Yeah.
Okay, now another area that was impacted by global events is military deployments overseas.
Right, so they've amended Section CII to support bringing back as many troops as possible.
Okay.
Obviously, there would be exceptions for things like protecting American assets overseas or treaty obligations.
Okay, so it's not a complete withdrawal, but the goal is to prioritize domestic needs.
Exactly. So they want to improve domestic defense infrastructure and crisis response.
Okay, so shifting the focus inward.
Yeah.
What about their stance on actually fighting the virus itself?
So they emphasize the need for lasting cures and universal vaccines for COVID-19.
Okay.
So they want the government to fund the development of these things and then release them into the public domain free of charge.
So anyone could access them?
Yeah, both for treatment and prevention.
Okay, so again, very pro-access.
Yeah.
Okay. I also noticed an amendment related to anti-aging research.
Yeah, so Section CIV initially talked about anti-aging in the context of COVID.
Right.
But they broadened it.
Okay.
So now they're saying that aging itself is a major risk factor for death and disability.
Right.
And they see that as a violation of the rights to life and health.
Okay.
So they want a permanent $100 billion annually for anti-aging research.
Wow. Okay, so that's a significant commitment.
Yeah.
Okay, and then finally there's an update regarding COVID testing.
So Section CX acknowledges their past support for widespread testing.
Right.
But now they're concerned about the lack of data on COVID prevalence. So they want to see a return to the level of data collection that we had back in early 2020.
Okay, and why is that?
They say it's important for tracking new variants.
Okay, so we can stay ahead of the virus.
Exactly.
All right, so that's a lot of platform updates.
Yeah, they've been busy.
Okay, so now let's talk about the new Article 9 about emergency actions.
Right, so this was added because they adopted Proposal ZRJG1.
Catchy name.
Yeah, it's called In Support of Decisive Executive Action in Times of Emergency.
Okay, so what does that mean?
Basically, it gives the chairman of the party more power to act quickly in emergencies.
Okay, so what kind of power are we talking about?
So the chairman can now take action to defend individuals, groups, or organizations that are aligned with the party's goals, and they don't need approval from the members.
Okay, so it's about acting swiftly.
Yeah.
Okay, so what are some specific things the chairman can do?
So they can advocate for the party, its members, and the platform.
Okay.
They can designate allies, and they can respond to attacks on the party.
Okay, so a lot of leeway. And what about accountability? Can the members challenge the chairman?
So they can criticize the chairman's actions, but they can't force them to retract any statements made during an emergency.
Okay, so a lot of power concentrated in one person.
Yeah.
Okay, so were there any alternative proposals considered?
Yeah, there were two others, RNS-1 and RNS-2.
Okay, and what were those about?
So those would have put limits on the USTP's ability to do investigations.
Okay.
And they would have defined more clearly what counts as an emergency.
Okay, so they would have limited the chairman's power.
Exactly.
But the party chose to go with the more centralized approach.
Yeah.
Okay, so it's clear that the U.S. Transhumanist Party is evolving rapidly, both in their platform and in their internal structure.
Yeah, they're responding to the world around them and to their own principles.
Right, so we've seen a lot of focus on individual liberty, technological solutions, and of course, a transhumanist worldview.
Yeah.
So for our listeners out there, I encourage you to think about what these changes mean for the future of the transhumanist movement.
Yeah. What are the implications for how they engage with politics?
Right. And if you want to dig deeper, you can always visit their website.
Absolutely. All the details are there.
So one final question for you all to consider. Given these new platform positions and this new approach to emergency actions, what do you see as the biggest opportunities and challenges for the U.S. Transhumanist Party moving forward? Okay, so you're here because you want to know what's going on like right now and like really get into it.
Yeah.
And we're going to do that today.
Yeah, we are.
We're going to look at this conversation between Gennady Stolyarov II and John Kretz.
Right.
And it's a post-election discussion after the 2024 election.
Yep.
And so we are going to just like dive right into this YouTube conversation they had and pull out all of the like really interesting stuff about the election. You know, what surprised people, Elon Musk.
Oh, yeah.
Identity politics, the whole thing.
The whole thing.
And we're also going to talk about where the Transhumanist Party sees things going forward.
Right. It's a really interesting conversation. I think they have some really unique perspectives.
Yeah, for sure.
One thing that really struck me right off the bat was John Kerritz's reaction to the election results.
Oh, yeah.
He was really surprised. And he even said, you know, maybe if there had been a different Democratic ticket, you know, maybe things would have turned out differently. And then he brought up this conversation he had with Elon Musk.
Oh, wow.
And he was kind of saying that, you know, he's hoping that Musk can kind of act as a buffer.
A buffer.
Yeah, like a moderating force within the administration.
Okay.
You know, pushing forward on things like space exploration, Neuralink, even alternative technologies, things like that.
Okay, so he's kind of seeing Musk as this potential like moderating or innovative force.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
Okay, cool.
Now, on the other hand, you have Gennady Stolyarov II. He had kind of a different take on the whole election outcome.
Okay.
You know, he said he wasn't really shocked that Trump won,
Uh-huh.
but he was surprised by the extent of the victory.
Like how much he won.
Exactly. It was a pretty huge sweep.
Wow.
You know, Trump won pretty much all the battleground states without even really breaking a sweat. And actually, Stolyarov said that he was relieved by how quickly the other side conceded.
Oh, interesting.
You know, he saw that as like a sign that the system's stable.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's really interesting.
Yeah, and what's really fascinating is Stolyarov's kind of like bigger picture view of why things played out this way.
Yeah.
You know, he argues that it's not just about left versus right, you know, like we always hear.
Right.
It's that there's this general dissatisfaction with the status quo.
Like globally.
Yeah, all over the world.
Hmm.
He thinks it has a lot to do with, you know, the effects of COVID, that rising inflation, major global events like the war in Ukraine, the instability in the Middle East.
Right.
You know, people are just looking for a change.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And this is where it gets really interesting.
Okay.
So Stolyarov has this theory that a lot of voters just went with the candidate they thought was most likely to win, who wasn't the incumbent party.
So whoever was already in power.
Exactly.
And he drew a parallel to the UK. You know how Keir Starmer and the Labour Party won there?
Oh, right.
After the Conservatives had been in power for so long.
Yeah, they were there forever.
Yeah, and, you know, he pointed out how Trump kind of, with help from figures like J.D. Vance, you know, really successfully presented himself as this kind of alternative to the establishment.
Which is wild because he was the establishment just a few years before.
I know, right?
Just like people forget or something.
Yeah, and you know what's really key here is what Stolyarov said about voters having short memories.
Oh, that's so true.
You know, everybody wants to forget about the pandemic, but those ripple effects, the economic fallout, the social divisions, you know, that stuff is still really affecting how people vote.
Absolutely.
For sure.
Yeah.
So then the conversation took this kind of sharp turn into this critique of what Stolyarov sees as left-wing identity politics.
Oh, yeah.
And he thinks this actually helped Trump gain some support.
Okay.
Well, he was really critical of what he called this like tendency to just label half the population as like inherently evil or bad or whatever. And he argued that a lot of Trump supporters, even though he doesn't agree with their solutions, are actually concerned about some very real problems that the establishment is just ignoring.
So, like, what kind of problems are we talking about?
Well, he specifically mentioned the rising cost of living. housing, healthcare.
Oh, yeah. Those are huge.
And then the traumas within higher education like this focus on identity politics.
Right.
He even compared what he sees as Russophobia on the American left to McCarthyism in the 50s.
Oh, wow.
Where there was all this suspicion and generalization.
Right. So it sounds like he's talking about this feeling that people have of being judged based on their group rather than who they are as individuals.
Exactly. And he acknowledges that this kind of frustration is a big part of why we saw the reaction we did in the election.
Right.
But he was very quick to point out that he doesn't think voting for Trump is the right answer, mainly because he thinks Trump himself engages in his own form of identity politics, especially with his stance on mass deportations.
Oh, right, right.
He's worried about increased policing and restrictions on civil liberties that could come with mass deportations.
Yeah.
And the potential for discrimination based on, where someone's from or what language they speak.
Yeah.
And he actually had a suggestion for the Democrats.
Really?
Yeah, he thinks they should really stand up for immigrants.
Yeah.
And that Biden should consider a broad amnesty.
Oh, wow. Like Reagan did in 86.
Exactly like Reagan's amnesty in 86.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
Okay.
And Stolyarov was very blunt.
Yeah.
He said he thinks the U.S. Transhumanist Party is basically the only truly pro-immigration party right now.
Wow.
Given what he sees as the kind of contradictions in the other party's approaches.
Right. Okay, so then they start talking about Elon Musk.
Yeah.
Right?
So Stolyarov had this really interesting perspective on Musk. He readily acknowledges all of his accomplishments.
Like with the electric vehicles and space exploration and...
All of that, yeah, the solar energy Neuralink.
Right.
But he also expressed some concerns.
Oh, okay. So he's like brilliant in some areas, but maybe out of his depth in others?
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
Okay.
He also brought up these concerns about the idea of like firing a ton of people in the federal government.
Yeah.
In the name of efficiency.
Right.
But he thinks that could backfire.
Okay, how so?
Well, he thinks he would end up losing all of this really important institutional knowledge.
Oh, right, because all these people have been working there forever.
Exactly.
Right.
And he pointed out that the contractors who would likely replace these people might end up being more expensive in the long run and could even have like their own agendas that don't really align with the public interest.
Right.
So he's pretty skeptical that this whole Department of Government efficiency thing that they're talking about, DOGE.
The Doge. Okay.
He's skeptical that that's really going to work.
Yeah, it seems like maybe too simple of a solution.
Yeah, and he was saying that real reform requires actually listening to the people who are working on the ground. The people who understand all the little details of how things work.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, so John Krechus actually chimed in here with some personal examples of government spending inefficiencies.
Oh, really?
Yeah, he told this story about having to buy a heat gun from a local store at like a crazy inflated price because of all these policies that are meant to support small businesses.
Oh, wow.
Which is a perfect example of how, these regulations, they can have these unintended consequences.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, so he kind of echoed Stolyarov's point about how new administrations often repeat the mistakes of the past.
Like they don't learn. Yeah, and he pointed out this pattern of, new leaders coming in with their great new ideas.
Yeah.
But those ideas have often been tried before.
Right, and they didn't work then.
Exactly.
Okay.
And then Carrots had this really interesting take on Trump's appeal.
Okay.
He thinks that Trump connects with certain people because he says things that they themselves want to say.
Like what?
Maybe things that they're thinking but wouldn't actually say out loud.
Right.
Things related to like dominance and strength.
Oh, wow.
And he even mentioned how people have analyzed Trump's body language, and they say it reinforces that kind of image.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Okay, so then they start talking about Kamala Harris and the Democratic Party.
Okay.
So Kurtz shared this really surprising story about hearing from women who felt that Harris wasn't a strong leader because she was a woman.
What?
I know, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then he talked about how he's heard from various minority groups who are worried about Hispanic populations changing their communities. Which, if you think about it, is kind of similar to the prejudices that past waves of immigrants have faced.
Right, like the Irish and the Italians.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting.
It is.
Okay, so Stolyarov had a really different take on this whole thing. He actually thinks there's a good chance we'll have a female president.
Oh, wow.
Maybe even a black female president in the next 20 years.
Mm-hmm.
But he thinks it'll be a conservative.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. He said someone like Condoleezza Rice.
Okay.
And then he went on to analyze Harris's situation,
Yeah.
Thinks that people saw her as staying in the background during Biden's term, just fulfilling the traditional VP role.
Right.
But then after that debate where Biden didn't do so well.
Yeah, everyone was talking about that.
He thinks the narrative around Harris kind of shifted. And J.D. Vance really used that to connect her to all the negative things people were saying about the Biden administration.
That's really smart.
Yeah. So it sounds like Harris was kind of stuck. She needed to separate herself from Biden, but she couldn't alienate her supporters.
All right. It's a tough spot to be in.
Yeah, definitely.
And Stolyarov made this point that Trump really understood and appealed to a certain part of the public that the establishment was kind of ignoring, the working class, non-college educated voters.
Right.
Especially in those Rust Belt states.
Right.
And he pointed out how the Democratic Party has changed over time.
Yeah.
They used to be party of the common man.
Right.
But now it seems like their main supporters are more upper class, white, educated liberals.
Okay.
And he suggested that they sometimes use minority groups strategically. He pointed out what he sees as inconsistencies in how they promote diversity.
Okay.
Like with all the negativity towards Russians.
Right.
And then he brought it back to Trump.
Okay.
And said that Trump's message to this group that's being overlooked is basically to blame immigrants.
Right.
Which is like the oldest trick in the book.
So what about the future?
Right. So they talked about that too.
Okay. Yeah.
There was that whole thing about Trump saying he might not need another election.
Oh, yeah. Everyone was talking about that.
Yeah. And Stolyarov thinks that maybe he was just talking to his Christian voter base.
Like saying, vote for me now and I'll fix things.
Exactly. Like a one-time thing.
Right.
But he did acknowledge Koretz's concern that it could be something more authoritarian.
Right.
And he thinks that Trump's decision to run again was partly about avoiding all those legal problems he was facing.
Oh, right. All the investigations and stuff.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
And he had this really interesting idea.
What's that?
That maybe Trump didn't even really want to win in 2016.
You're kidding?
I know, right?
Wow.
He thinks maybe he just wanted to boost his brand.
Oh, to help his businesses.
Yeah, exactly.
Wow.
And the thing that surprised Stolyarov was that Trump actually tried to fulfill some of his campaign promises in his first term.
Even though his administration was kind of a mess.
Yeah, pretty much.
Right.
But he thinks in a second Trump administration, things would be different.
Like how?
Well, he thinks Trump would bring in more unconventional people.
Like?
Like maverick types.
Mm-hmm.
And he said that he sees Trump as someone who's driven by cynical opportunism rather than like deep principles.
Okay.
But he does have some hope for positive things in foreign policy.
Like what?
Well, he thinks there's a chance Trump could negotiate an end to the war in Ukraine.
Wow, that would be huge.
Yeah, it would.
Okay.
And he agreed with Koretz that both parties really serve the political elite.
Yeah.
He said the Democrats are often like the rebellious children of the Republicans. And Stolyarov made it very clear that he's against violent revolution.
Okay.
Historically, those haven't worked out so well.
Right.
He said they usually require this counter elite.
Right.
That's not any better than the people they replaced.
Right.
But he's optimistic about a more gradual change in society driven by technology. He thinks technology can ease some of the pressure and create a more peaceful future.
Right.
But he also stressed how important it is to keep society stable so that we can continue making progress in things like health and longevity.
Right. Right.
And of course, they had to talk about the Transhumanist Party's plans.
Yeah.
For the next 4 years.
Okay, so what are they going to do?
Well, Stolyarov said they're going to focus on building up their activism at the local level.
Okay.
And they want to team up with other minor parties like the Pirate Party.
Right.
And he even hinted at this really big, innovative thing they're planning for the 2028 election.
Oh, wow. That's interesting.
Yeah, he wouldn't give any details.
So mysterious.
I know.
But he did invite people to join the Transhumanist Party.
Yeah, it's free to join.
Okay.
Just go to transhumanistparty.org.
Okay, cool.
And he emphasized that they're committed to being the loyal opposition, and doing objective policy analysis.
Right.
And they'll even praise positive things, if they happen.
Like if there's peace in Ukraine.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So I think it's really variable to think about all these different perspectives.
Yeah.
And the surprising stuff that came out of this discussion.
Yeah, for sure.
And this deep dive, has hopefully given you a quicker way to understand all these really complex issues.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So we'll leave you with this final thought from Gennady Stolyarov II.
Oh, okay.
He's really hopeful about the potential of technology to solve a lot of the problems we're facing. But he thinks it's really important to guide that technology wisely.
Makes sense.
And he believes it could lead to a future where people live longer and healthier lives.
That would be amazing.
Yeah.
Wow.
But that future depends on us avoiding these big societal disruptions.
Right.
So if you want to learn more,
yeah,
go check out the U.S. Transhumanist Party's website. and Gennady Stolyarov II's YouTube channel.
It's definitely worth a look.
Yeah, they have some really interesting ideas about American politics.
Yeah, a whole different approach.
Yeah, for sure.
So as you go forward, think about the specific ways that technology might affect the things we talked about today.
That's a great point.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the world is changing so fast.
That really is.
And technology is a big part of that.
Absolutely.
So yeah, food for thought.
Food for thought.
All right, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me. Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're trying to make sense of the first couple of months of the second Trump administration.
Yeah, cutting through all the noise.
Exactly. We're using an interview from OSH Radio back on March 21st, 2025, with Gennady Stolyarov II. He's the chairman of the U.S. Transhumanist Party as our guide.
Right, so it gives a snapshot of his thinking on current events back then, and he makes some, well, interesting comparisons. The goal is to pull out the key political moves and, figure out what they might actually mean.
So what's the first big takeaway from that interview?
Well, the thing that just leaps out is the sheer pace. Gennady Stolyarov described it as a continuous set of activities on multiple fronts. It's almost dizzying.
Dizzying, yeah.
Yeah.
Makes it hard to tell if there's a grand plan or if it's more...
scattershot?
Exactly. Is it a coordinated strategy or just a whole lot happening at once?
Yeah.
Feels different from the first term. Remember how legal challenges popped up almost immediately back then?
Oh, definitely. Seemed to slow things down quite a bit early on.
This time it feels like there's this real push, this urgency right out of the gate.
So, what areas saw the most action, according to the interview? Several big ones were flagged. First, this new Department of Government Efficiency, DOGE, they're calling it. Then actions aimed at political opponents, mass deportations getting underway, some shifts in foreign policy, and a lot of back and forth on trade wars and tariffs put in place that may be pulled back or delayed.
Okay, let's start with DOGE, the Department of Government Efficiency. The interview raised some pretty serious questions about how it's actually working.
Yeah, the main criticism highlighted is that its approach seems kind of haphazard, maybe indiscriminate even.
How so?
Well, the point made was that, a huge chunk of government waste might actually be tied up in contracts, especially with politically connected companies.
Okay, makes sense.
But DOGE seems to be focusing mainly on just cutting headcount, reducing the number of government employees across the board.
Which, on the surface, sounds like shrinking government, right? It's often the goal.
Sure, but Gennady Stolyarov II really questions the outcome. Is it smart? Are they cutting essential people or just numbers?
And the worry, as brought up in the interview, is that it could actually backfire. You lose experienced staff, maybe essential functions suffer.
Right. And then what happens? You might end up needing to hire more outside contractors to plug the holes.
Which can be way more expensive and maybe less efficient in the long run.
Precisely. So, it makes you question if the real goal is genuine efficiency or maybe something else.
It's a classic problem, isn't it? Focusing on headcount numbers looks decisive, but doesn't always fix the underlying issues.
And the interview also brings up the role of Congress here. Congress is technically the body that creates and funds agencies. So are these executive actions maybe stepping on their toes a bit?
That's a really important constitutional point. And it connects to another thing mentioned, Project 2025.
Ah, yes. The mandate for leadership.
Which, as the interview notes, has this pretty explicit goal of replacing career civil servants, the people who are supposed to be nonpartisan experts, with political loyalists.
It's a fundamental shift away from that ideal of an objective civil service, the sort of technocrats just doing their jobs regardless of who's in power.
And it's interesting, this idea of radical fast change. It's not even universally supported by people who might want smaller government. You mentioned Ayn Rand.
Yeah, that was a fascinating bit. Gennady Stolyarov brought up her perspective from way back in 1962. Someone asked her what she'd do as president.
What did she say? Tear it all down overnight.
Quite the opposite, actually. She apparently warned against sudden, sweeping changes, called it disastrous, arbitrary, dictatorial action.
Wow. From Ayn Rand, that's surprising.
Isn't it? Her advice was for gradual decontrol, maybe over 3 years, to let the economy and society adjust. So the point being made was, even if you agree with the end goal, less government interference, perhaps the way you get there, the speed and planning, really matters.
So Rand might look at the goals of something like Project 2025 and perhaps agree with some, but strongly disagree with the proposed method, the speed, the lack of a transition plan.
That seems plausible based on her 1962 comments, yeah. It really makes you think about whether the administration, as the interview speculated, felt they were operating under some kind of, tight deadline.
A limited window to make changes before opposition could mobilize, or maybe before the next election cycle?
Could be a sense of urgency driving things. Maybe the current administration feels that shock therapy is the only way, even if it causes some short-term pain.
Perhaps. But Gennady Stolyarov II clearly voiced concerns that these layoffs aren't necessarily based on merit or actual need.
And that's where you get the potential for really damaging unintended consequences, like losing expertise that's hard to replace.
The interview mentioned those maybe anecdotal but still scary examples involving Elon Musk briefly firing air traffic controllers, people managing nuclear weapons, Ebola response teams.
Yeah, those examples, they illustrate the risk. In some cases, there was a later realization like, oops, maybe that was a mistake, but the bureaucratic machinery, the termination process was already in motion and hard to stop.
Wow.
If you make cuts without understanding the critical functions, things could go sideways very, very quickly.
And apparently, even some cabinet secretaries within the administration weren't happy, frustrated about not being consulted on cuts.
Which suggests maybe not everyone is on the same page internally, a lack of coordination, perhaps?
Yeah, paints a picture of potential internal friction.
And then there's the public reaction. John Kretz touched on that sort of love-hate thing people have with government workers.
Right. You need the services, but you also complain about bureaucracy or inefficiency. It's complicated.
It really is. So how the public ultimately responds to these cuts, it's hard to predict. But the interview drew a parallel to past government shakeups,
where big changes led to unexpected problems down the line.
Exactly. And then you end up spending a lot of money later. So the question raised is, are these rapid cuts actually going to save money in the long run, or just create new, expensive problems?
It's a critical question. And maybe even more concerning, Gennady Stolyarov II observed a potential shift in the nature of the opposition.
Yeah, the argument being that this very aggressive, maybe blunt approach could be sparking a different kind of resistance, something potentially less civil.
The example given was acts of vandalism, sabotage against Tesla vehicles, contrasting that with the mostly peaceful, large-scale marches we saw early in the first term.
It suggests maybe a different level of frustration or anger is building.
It definitely raises concerns about increasing polarization and maybe even instability if people feel their voices aren't being heard through normal channels.
Yeah, alienating large groups isn't usually a recipe for smooth sailing.
Okay, let's shift gears slightly as we move toward our wrap-up. The whole job cuts discussion apparently sparked a conversation in the interview about AI.
Right, the idea that maybe cutting human jobs could accelerate the need for AI or even the singularity. But Gennady Stolyarov offered a more grounded take on where AI is now.
What was the assessment?
Basically that current AI systems, like large language models, are really good at processing public information, answering questions based on that data.
Okay, like a super-powered search engine or research assistant.
Kind of, but they lack the deep contextual understanding of individual situations. They can't really make nuanced executive decisions that require judgment based on specific, often non-public factors.
And they mentioned the hallucination problem.
Yeah, where AI basically makes stuff up but presents it as fact. It's a known issue. Yeah. So the point was, AI is a powerful tool, definitely useful for collaboration.
But it can't fully replace human expertise, especially in complex roles needing real judgment and understanding of intricate systems. Not yet, anyway.
Exactly. Though maybe in those kinds of highly structured, rule-following roles, current AI might actually perform better than a human stuck to a script.
Huh. Interesting point. Okay, let's tie this back to the administration's economic policies. Tariffs came up a lot.
Yes, and the concerns there were pretty stark. Gennady Stolyarov pointed directly to the potential for, well, making everything more expensive for regular people, cost of living going up.
And also hurting American companies, right?
Yeah.
If they rely on imported parts or materials.
Absolutely. Plus, the almost inevitable consequence, other countries hitting back with their own tariffs on U.S. goods. Retaliation.
The interview brought up some history here. The British Corn Laws.
Yeah, a classic example of protectionism that ultimately failed. And just the general consensus among most economists that high tariffs tend to do more harm than good overall.
There was a specific company example, too, Harley-Davidson.
Right. Mentioning Reagan's tariffs that were meant to help Harley, but then later the company got hit hard by retaliatory tariffs from other countries. It shows how these things can have complex, sometimes unintended effects.
So, looking at the bigger political picture, what's Gennady Stolyarov's sense of where this is all heading? This initial blitz, as they called it.
the expectation seems to be that it's going to run into more resistance from the courts, from within the government agencies themselves, maybe from Congress, and certainly from the public.
So the rapid pace might not be sustainable.
Likely not. And the point was also made that the underlying issues that maybe helped get Trump elected, things like frustration about the cost of living, economic anxiety, these policies don't seem to be addressing those.
In fact, tariffs could make them worse.
Potentially, yes. Which led to some speculation in the interview about, diversion tactics, focusing attention elsewhere.
Like symbolic gestures. I think renaming the Gulf of Mexico was mentioned briefly.
Yeah, things like that, which grab headlines but don't really change the fundamentals for most people.
The interview also noted how the old labels Republican and Democrat feel like they're shifting, maybe breaking down.
Definitely. A sense that maybe the traditional parties aren't fully connecting anymore, creating an opening for third parties or different kinds of political movements, a feeling that maybe the folks in charge are out of touch.
Though John Kerry acknowledged that some of Trump's style, that sort of kick-butt-and-take-names attitude, did resonate with that feeling of being ignored by the establishment.
True. It's a complex dynamic. So, looking ahead, the main prediction from the source was a likely slowdown in the pace of change within the next, say, 40 days or so, as resistance builds.
But the bigger worry expressed was, what?
A continuing era of, chaos and division. Gennady, Stolyarov even floated the idea that maybe the power elite, so to speak, actually benefits from keeping everyone divided. Divide and rule.
That's a pretty provocative thought.
It is. And it led to a call, really, for people listening, for you to try and look beyond that two-party fight, to focus on shared goals, shared human values.
And the U.S. Transhumanist Party was presented as an example of an alternative, focused on problem solving, using technology.
Yeah, basically an invitation to check out different approaches, different ways of thinking about the future that aren't just locked into the same old battles.
A call to transcend the division.
But of course, the final word was caution. You never know what unexpected event, a black swan, might come along and change everything.
Right. The future remains pretty unpredictable.
Yeah.
Definitely gives us, and you, a lot to think about as things unfold.